In this culture, publicly destroying your wealth was the fastest way to gain power. Along the northwest coast of North America, several indigenous groups practiced for centuries a ceremony known as Potlatch. It was not a simple celebration, but an extreme display of status. Here, power was not accumulated, it was destroyed. During a potlatch, leaders hosted large gatherings where they gave away or even destroyed vast amounts of goods, such as blankets, food, tools, and valuable objects. The more you gave away, or lost, the higher your prestige. Anthropologists documented that the goal was not waste, but to prove that one possessed so much power that nothing needed to be kept. Classic studies by Franz Boas and the analysis of Marcel Mauss explain that this ritual reinforced hierarchies, alliances, and collective memory. Wealth was not ownership. It was the ability to give or destroy. Here, losing everything was not weakness. It was dominance. While the modern world accumulates to feel secure, this culture understood something different. True power is not what you keep, but what you can lose without disappearing. What do you think about this story? Comment now and follow for more.